Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome here. My name is Niamh King. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Strategic Content here at the Chicago Council. As you know, this program is exclusively for our members, so thank you very much for your support. And if you're a guest, we'd love to encourage you to join. It's only $100 and you get wonderful access to all kinds of fantastic programming. Before we start, please note that the Council is an independent, nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Copies of Secretary Albright's Fascism, a Warning book will be available for sale and signing after the program from our partners at the bookseller, and this will take place at the room behind you beyond the elevators. The book was published on April 10th, and it debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. We kindly ask that you remain seated at the end of the event so that Secretary Albright can pop out to make sure she can sign all the books. This morning, Secretary Albright will be in conversation with our Council President, Ivo Daalder, and after he completes his conversation, there'll be time for you to ask questions. But now, to formally introduce our speaker and frame the discussion, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Faye Hartog-Levin. She's a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council, where she works on a variety of political, international, and environmental issues, and she previously served as the 65th Ambassador of the United States to the Netherlands from 2009 to 2011. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Levin to the Council.
Thank you, Niamh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. It's an honor to welcome Secretary Madeleine Albright back to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I'm rather impressed that so many of you have gotten up so early to hear such an unsettling conversation. As pleased as we are to host Secretary Albright, she's here to deliver a disquieting description of our political moment. Some might say that the 20th century was shaped by the global contest between democracy and authoritarianism. By the end of the Cold War, some assumed that history had been decided in favor of liberalism and openness. Yet today, the pendulum seems to be swinging back towards nativism, populism, and strongmen leaders, even in the West. A week ago, I had the I can't say pleasure, but I had the experience of revisiting Yad Vashem, Israel's memorial and museum to the Holocaust, where the story of the rise of fascism in the 30s is retold and how it led to the genocide of the 40s. And so when you consider how some of the warning signs were not heeded then, it is at least comforting to know that we're talking about some of the same problems now. Secretary Albright has been at the forefront of the global fight for democracy. Her personal story and career have been shaped by the events that unfolded in the 20th century. In her latest book, Fascism, a Warning, she draws on her experiences as a child in war-torn Europe and her distinguished career as a diplomat to question why we appear to be once again sliding in the direction of extreme and illiberal politics. It's my pleasure to introduce Secretary Albright, although I doubt she needs an introduction. Currently, she serves as chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm, and chair of Albright Capital Management, an investment advisory firm focused on emerging markets. To refresh your recollection about her distinguished career, in 1997, she was named the 64th U.S. Secretary of State, becoming the first female to hold that position, and served for 4 years. From 1993 to 1997, she served as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. In 2012, Secretary Albright was awarded the nation's highest civilian honor, the Medal of Freedom, by President Barack Obama, in recognition of her contributions to international peace and democracy. She has previously authored or co-authored 5 books. Joining Secretary Madeleine Albright in discussion this morning is the Council's President, Ambassador Ivo Daalder. Ivo Daalder served from 2009 to 2013 as the U.S. Ambassador to NATO and as Director of European Affairs under Bill Clinton's National Security Council from 1995 to 1997. He's the author and editor of 10 books, including the newest book, The Empty Throne: How America Abdicated Its Global Leadership, which will be published in the fall of 2018. We're also very honored to be joined this morning in this morning's important conversation by a good friend of the Chicago Council, Senator Dick Durbin. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Secretary Madeleine Albright and Ivo Dalder.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary, thanks so much for joining us here today, even though perhaps the next hour won't be the most, it will be lively, but positive and optimistic story. As we were talking a little earlier, you said, I'm by nature an optimist. That raises the question, then why did you write this book?
Well, I am an optimist, but I worry a lot. But let me say how glad I am to be in Chicago. I lived here in 1960, and I cast my first presidential vote for John Kennedy, and it really counted. So I'm delighted to be here. And I used to work for Encyclopedia Britannica, which I have to explain to my students is a book. But I love being in Chicago, so thank you very much. The reason that I did write the book is that I am concerned about what is going on, and frankly, I was going to write it no matter what happened in the elections, because I think there's certain trends that are worrisome. And what I decided to do was to go back, and a lot of the book is history, to try to figure out how come there was fascism in the first place, and what are the things that are going on now. And so, you know, we all know that saying now, which is see something, say something. I've added to that, do something. And so what I have done is, in fact, write the book, and I'm delighted to have a chance to talk about it. And I think the issues really are what is going on in society that has created the divisions that we see. And as the ambassador said, we were all very excited at the end of the Cold War, and there was really such an incredible sense of euphoria, and yet there has been a real sense of not having achieved things, and in fact, those divisions are getting worse. And the sign of a fascist-type leader is he exacerbates the differences. And that's what I wanted to show. And also, as going through the history of everything, and I write about Mussolini and Hitler, and then I take a look at some of our friends and allies, what's happened in Turkey, Poland, Hungary, the Philippines, and Venezuela. These are people that were all, either Mussolini and Hitler got power constitutionally, and the others were elected to office. And so what the book does is really examine the trends and take a look at what fascism really means. And what it is an identification with a tribalist, nationalist group at the exclusion of others, and where it's very much an us versus them, and a sense that democratic institutions don't matter, and that a free press is not the major part of what is needed. And so there are other characteristics, but I decided to write because of what I was seeing.
And the warning part is you see this as the dominant trend in major parts of our societies?
More and more, unfortunately. And I think that part of the issue is that the problems are serious. And people hate it when you say that's complicated, because what they really want is some kind of answers. And the answers are more forthcoming in the simpler the answers are, especially when they are put forward by a demagogue. And so I think, and when whatever the newest information tool is, when that is then used by X person in order to push a very simplistic message and continue to divide the people, it's that exacerbation of the division rather than trying to find common ground.
Let me go step back for a second, because I wonder the degree to which your own life story is one of the main reasons why this is an issue that that is so evident and important. You were a refugee from the then Czechoslovakia, returned, saw the return of the coming of communism. You've seen fascism and communism and totalitarianism in action, and then came to the United States and have become one of the great Americans of our time. Is part of the reason why one worries about these trends is because, in part, you have lived them?
Yeah. Well, it is very personal in that regard. I was born in 1937, 1 year before the Munich Agreement, which anybody that has studied the history of Czechoslovakia knows that it was really a watershed time. And it's interesting because there's so many connections always between Czechoslovakia and Chicago, actually. And what happened was Thomas Garrigue Masaryk, who was the first president of Czechoslovakia, spent time at the University of Chicago and here in many different ways. And I have to always, he was married to an American, Charlotte Garrigue, and he took her maiden name as his middle name in a marriage that took place at the end of the 19th century. And the Czechoslovak Constitution was based on the American one, with one real difference. It actually had equal rights language in it in 1918. And what was interesting is, in so many ways, Czechoslovakia was a model democracy in the interwar period. And so it did have a minority issue. There was a German minority in Czechoslovakia, and they were not happy, and they were basically manipulated by a man called Konrad Henlein, who was associated with the fascist Nazi movement. And then, and this is one of the lessons, as a result of an agreement, Munich, where the British and French made an agreement with the Germans and Italians over the head of the Czechoslovaks, the country I was born in was sold down the river. And then the Nazis marched in March 1939. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and one of that first generation of people, I used to ask my father whether I was a Czech or a Slovak, and he said, "You're a Czechoslovak," because that was the real concept of the country, and they were real patriots. And so what happened was that when the Nazis marched in, we managed to escape and lived in England all through the war, and then returned, and I didn't have much of a concept of this, but there was no family. Everybody had been killed. I did not know until I became Secretary of State that I was of Jewish background. By the way, I was raised a Catholic, married an Episcopalian, and found out I was Jewish, so I have my interfaith discussions about myself. But I think that what did happen, and I later discovered that 26 members of my family died in the Holocaust. So, and the West didn't do anything. That's the part. America was not present at Munich. Then, when we were in England during the war, the Americans came, and I remember as a little girl seeing the Americans come, and that's when I fell in love with Americans in uniform. Then, what happened after the war was, as a result of agreements, Czechoslovakia was behind the Iron Curtain, and these were agreements that were made between the US and the Soviet Union. And again, we had to leave. And again, here, the question was how democracy was used, in fact, to be undermined. The Czechoslovaks did have a democracy. They, during the interwar period, had even had a legal communist party and a socialist party. And the democratic ministers, when things weren't going right, took a democratic step and resigned. And they thought, in fact, that they would be supported by the President Beneš, and he was not strong enough to push back. So once it was a dictator that took over, and another time a system, communism. And so that's what I grew up with, and I really do think that I learned a lot of lessons. We came to the United States. My father defected and asked for political asylum. We were refugees. And then he talked about the fact, first of all, he said there's nothing better than to be a professor in a free country, but he also was afraid that Americans would take democracy for granted.
It's a warning we're living with every day, and an important one. Moving forward, Sam Huntington wrote a wonderful book in 1991 called The Third Wave of Democracy, having looked at what had happened in Latin America, in Europe, with Portugal and Spain, and then, of course, in the beginning of the 90s, the change throughout Eastern Europe, this massive wave of democratization we were seeing all over the world, and this was a time of great optimism. It was a time when you entered the cabinet of a new president, first as UN Secretary and then as Secretary of State, and we had this sense that, as Frank Fukuyama called it, history was ending and liberal democracy was on the march. And I guess one of the questions is, was that a momentary blip in our history? Are we at a point where we're just in a hiccup phase, where we need to go to the next point? How do you look back at this period and it's the sense that things were moving in this extraordinary direction from the 80s with Ronald Reagan onwards, strong leadership by the United States for democracy around the world, and then in the last 5-10 years, things were moving in a different direction?
Well, I do think that one has to try to figure out what happened before I went into office. I was a professor, and I also did an awful lot of work on Central and Eastern Europe. The world was saved from a genuinely boring book when I was going to write about all the apparatchiks that were going to take over in Central and Eastern Europe. Then the wall came down. And the euphoria that happened was just stunning in so many ways. I went to Czechoslovakia as part of the National Democratic Institute and met with Václav Havel for the first time and explained that we were there to help, in terms of trying to help them with the nuts and bolts of democracy. And what Havel asked me to do was to try to get people in to help them write a new electoral law and any number of different things. I also had gone to Hungary before that and met with Viktor Orban when he was superstar dissident, and he was a darling everywhere, and in fact George Soros funded him to get an education at Oxford. And he started a young people's party. As he got older, so did the party. But he was part of this great movement. And then in Poland, I had spent a lot of time there, interviewed Lech Wałęsa, studied what was going on. And I think we thought that because this was in the middle of Europe and because all the polling data had shown that they wanted to be Europeans and be a part of things, and they were ready to welcome us and learn. And I think that we all are now wondering what actually happened and whether we did not pay enough attention to the workers, even though Wałęsa spent most of his time there, because the people that we dealt with wanted to have freedom of speech and be able to select their own government. And the other people, in many ways, had more services, safety nets and things under communism. And then all of a sudden they saw a lot of corruption and they wondered how this had all gone down the drain. But I think it's something we need to study. The other part that I think was a huge mistake, we shouldn't have said that we won the Cold War. Mm-hmm. They lost the Cold War, and that isn't just a semantic difference. The system failed, and I don't think we understood that well enough and kind of were very hubris in terms of that we had won the Cold War.
So you've laid the predicate already for basically the book, because the rest, the book describes these leaders who have emerged, whether it's Erdogan in Turkey or Orban in Hungary and other strong men. I mean, this is the age of strong men in some ways, in many ways elected strong men, as you rightly say. And why do strong men win elections? How do they do this in this climate? You mentioned that the workers were ignored in some ways. That you said earlier when we were talking separately, we were talking to the elites, and the elites are very comfortable talking to the elites, and we weren't spending enough time thinking about what was happening in these societies. Is that why strong men because they do speak to the non-elite in some way, that they win? Well,
I think partially, and I really tried to be fair about this in the following way, which is that they have been elected. And Erdogan is a very interesting example. Yeah. I was actually known as a Turkophile because I'd been in the Carter administration when we lifted the embargo and spent a lot of time on Turkey, and also when I was at the UN and later. And it was complicated because they, in fact, had some military coups. They also, to a great extent, had governments that were run by the fancy people that lived on the other side of the Bosporus. And Erdogan came in, and actually the AKP, his party, did constituency services. They delivered. They were helping out in the rural areas in Anatolia and various places, and he won fair and square. There's no question. And then he began to deliver a better economy. And then what happened was that it all went to his head, and he began to seize more and more power, and wanted to change the Constitution. That's one of the things that happens, is to change the law. He has just called snap elections again for June, and he is going to obviously win them, and he is going to do more to create a presidential system. So he's responded to the problems. And Mussolini responded to the problems initially, and then seizes power and starts arresting people. There are more journalists that have been arrested and professors in Turkey than in a lot of other places. And they also are very important in terms, and to some degree damaging, to many of the problems that are going on in the Middle East. So he's a perfect example of this, but the others also have some simple answers to the problems and say it is the other people's fault. And that is where we go back to the beginning of all of this, where there's always a scapegoat. And the scapegoat is usually some foreigner.
The U.S., you personally, more than probably any other American stateswoman person, has been a leader in promoting democracy abroad for many, many years. And you mentioned the involvement in Central and Eastern Europe, but you were the one who created the Community of Democracies when you were Secretary of State, a group of 100. By the time you left, I think over 100 countries that would come together to talk about democracy. And American leadership in forging it and making this real was fundamental. As we move in an era where the United States is no longer leading, and hasn't for quite a while on some of these issues, and I don't think this is just in the current administration, I think it's true to some extent in other administrations, how much of an impact is the absence of the kind of American leadership that we saw, let's say in the 80s and the 90s, because of course Ronald Reagan was a great leader in this effort too. Its absence in this century, how much is that part of the story?
Very much so. And let me just say, Ronald Reagan, he spoke in London in '83 at Parliament and talked about the fact that democracies did not explain themselves very well vis-a-vis communism. And he came back to the United States and he started something called the Endowment for Democracy, which has 4 institutes under it: Democrats and Republicans, business and labor, kind of the warp and woof. And I was the first vice chair of the Democratic Institute, and we really didn't know what we were supposed to do, because various countries, the Germans, for instance, have institutes, their parties each have institutes that promote democracy, and it seemed like the right thing to do in the U.S. And so that the NDI and IRI, by the way, John McCain is chairman of IRI, and we do a lot of things together. And so that was kind of the beginning of it. You mentioned the Community of Democracies. What happened was, after we were out of office, President George W. Bush had a meeting initially of former people, I call it, and we were given briefings on Iraq. And it was a stage where they were talking about, he came into the Roosevelt room and started talking about the fact that we really had to support democracies. That was the thing to do. So as we're leaving that room, and he said to me, "Let me show you how I've redecorated the Oval Office." So we went, and I said, "Mr. President, I'm so glad you're talking about supporting democracy, but you act as though you invented democracy when actually I did." And he did laugh. So, but I do think that one of the things that we were doing through NDI is, in fact, to try to provide that nuts and bolts for democracy. And the Community of Democracy was set up in a way to share best practices. Again, And I think that it is an essential part. I do believe you can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. But I think that there has to be a way that the U.S. does, as the world's oldest democracy, talk about it. And the thing that I have found very troubling is that we don't do that anymore. And we, all of us that have been in office, you in your time, when you talk to foreigners about what you're doing, you talk about your values. You may not do that, in press conferences, but there wasn't any time I went anywhere that I didn't talk about the importance of the rule of law and democracy, and I don't think that's happening. And our absence, well, two things. One, not only are we absent, but we have a president who goes to Poland and stands beside the leader and praises them for what they're doing in terms of making sure that their judiciary is no longer very powerful and just generally limiting speech. And so our absence is part of the problem. The chair is empty, and people are wondering where we are, why we're not talking about what our value system is.
So who's filling that vacuum now that we're no longer doing that?
Well, interestingly enough, the Chinese, a great democracy. But they are, what is interesting, the Chinese are talking about one belt, one road in terms of how they're projecting their power. They must be getting very fat because the belt is larger and larger. And they are, in fact, using a lot of their tools. By the way, I teach at Georgetown, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? So my course is called the National Security Toolbox. And some of it has to do with diplomacy, some of it with economic tools. And the Chinese are using their economic tools in terms of providing aid and grants and trying to create jobs overseas. And basically extracting their resources, but they are using those tools and filling a vacuum that we have left. And by the way, my whole life story is that when the U.S. is absent, as it was at Munich, terrible things happen. When the U.S. comes in, as they did during World War II, that helped. And then when the U.S. cut Europe in half, that hurt. And so I could go through all kinds of history in terms of what happens when the U.S. is absent.
Well, it's a good, for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, that's a good message to remember. It's why we were founded in 1922, to remind why what happens in the world matters to people here in the United States. You mentioned the division of Europe. Are we seeing a redivision of Europe, in part because of American absence, but in part because what's happening in Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic to a lesser extent, and other parts, a redivision between East and West?
I do see that. And let me just say, part of the thing that was supposed to happen after World War II came as a result of ethnic conflicts and domination and a lack of understanding of democracy. And the European Union, after the coal and steel community, was set up in order to make sure that hyper-nationalism did not return and that there was a way that Europeans found common ground on issues. What has happened, and what I find interesting in this era is kind of a mega trend. Globalization is not a four-letter word, but the bottom line is that a variety of global or regional institutions are somewhat faceless. And when they talk about the faceless bureaucrats in Brussels, there's some truth to that. And what has happened is that in the obverse of that is the rise of nationalism. And what is also, it's the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, and the countries that were in Central and Eastern Europe were actually founded on the basis of national identity. And so all of a sudden, that has returned as kind of a pushback against the faceless bureaucrats, and hyper-nationalism. It's one thing to know what your identity is, and it's very important, but if my identity hates your identity, it's very dangerous. So that has been happening primarily in Central and Eastern Europe, and for reasons that are totally unclear to me, given how much they get out of the European Union, they are all of a sudden very anti-Western European, and the Western Europeans, frankly, are bit snobbish about the Eastern Europeans. I think they have made them feel like second-class citizens. And so there really is a division now. And when you are feeling disrespected, then you find an enemy. And what has happened, especially in Hungary, is all of a sudden ethnic purity and a lot of pushing back on the refugees that have come there. So the refugees, in many cases, are now viewed as the scapegoat. And as I said earlier, it always needs a scapegoat.
So that in part explains the division between the West and Eastern Europe. Are you worried at all about the trend of populism and, in fact, the reaction on the refugee crisis in Western Europe and the future of the democracy in places that have been democratic for a very, very long time? We saw Brexit, of course. We saw a huge debate in Germany. In France, we had an election in Italy in which more than 50% voted for the far right and the far right and the loony whatever right in terms of the Five-Star Movement. To what sense do you have of the stability of these parts of Europe, more in the middle and the south than the north?
I am worried about it, and I think some of it, again, has to do with economic issues and with how well people have recovered from the financial crisis, but also this kind of sense of finding somebody that is at fault for the divisions. There are divisions in society. They always have been. Now we have the issue of technology, where I think people have lost jobs as a result of innovations in technology, and it's easy to blame people. So in England, it was the Poles, the Polish Poles, that had taken their jobs, and there was this kind of finger pointing, and we're seeing it in a variety of places. I find very interesting, President Macron in France is trying very hard to push back against that, and I think that he is kind of being accused of, what did they call it, the Jupiter syndrome or something, that he thinks he's got answers to everything, and maybe pushing too hard on the sanctity and greatness of the European Union, but he's onto something, and the other leaders are not particularly pushing back on it. They're nervous about it, and it does have to do with the issue of, quote, foreigners, and if they're Muslims, then it's even more complicated. Or they go back in history and say they were taken over by the Turks earlier, the Ottomans, and so there's kind of a recall of history that is wrong, and then there are these divisions that are exacerbated by the leaders of these far-right parties.
Let's turn to across the Atlantic to here at home. You write in your book that Americans have lost confidence in their institutions. These institutions have served us extraordinarily well for well over 200 years, and the trust seems to have been lost. Why do you think Americans have lost trust, and how do we start rebuilding it?
Well, I think I have really been trying to look at generally what has been going on and spend a lot of time thinking and talking about technology and social media and a variety of aspects. I stole this line just flat out from Silicon Valley. It's totally plagiarized, but it answers things so well. Is people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and are providing 19th century responses. And so there is not really a dealing with the particular issues that are out there. And I think that there is such a sense of lack of connection between the governments. And frankly, it's the local governments that are have the trust of the people, mayors and city councils, and then state governments. I hate to sit here and look at Senator Durbin and say this, but I do.
You may run for mayor.
That, by the way, I worked on the Hill for Senator Muskie in the 70s, and he was the first chairman of the budget committee when the budget process came in. And the thing he taught all of us was you have to be bipartisan. Our first instructions were to go work with Senator Bellman of Oklahoma, who was ranking. But bottom line is, I do think, and I have been saying this, The Constitution, the first article of the Constitution is about Congress, and this is Article 1 time. And I think the question is how, in fact, Congress begins to reassert its power, but it does require an awful lot of compromise and things. As I said, compromise is not a four-letter word. The fact that I could deal with Jesse Helms, I was really working on that. But I do think that there is not trust, but most of it is that there are major complexities. The social media is very much a part of it, where I happen to believe that the essential part is a free press, and I'm not sure I fully understand how the social media system is working and whether we need more regulations, but part of it is this lack of faith that the government is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, and as I said earlier, the social contract is broken. People gave up their individual rights, some of them, in order to be served and protected by the government, and the governments are not doing their part, and the citizens aren't either, in terms of going out and taking responsibility of being actively involved.
You mentioned a free press. Sort of at the core of democracy is not only access to information, but believing the information out there is true. Have we lost that moment?
I think the hard part is, and first of all, when I used to be a real academic, I wrote about the role of information in political change. And I wrote my dissertation on the Czechoslovak press in 1968 and on the Polish press. And just generally, there's always some invention that's out there. But having information is power. And so the question is, what do we know about the information that we get? And I think that there is a problem in that everybody is much more kind of in an echo chamber of listening to what they already believe in. By the way, you should all be glad you live in Chicago and not Washington, because I listen to right-wing radio as I drive, and I yell and scream, and at some point I will be arrested. But I do think that people need to listen to what they disagree with, and that is not happening. And then I do think the hard part is, and that makes me sound like a relativist, but absolute truth is difficult to find. And so what needs to happen, we were talking about reading newspapers earlier. I read 4 newspapers in the morning, the Post, the Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times. And what I do is kind of look to see what collection of facts actually are repeated in various places, even though there may be different analysis. But I do think that's the kind of thing that has to happen. And not just sit there and listen to the only thing that you already agree with. And then I truly do think, I was fascinated by the Zuckerberg hearings, is something does have to happen, because technology is a wonderful new gift, but it is also being misused. And we haven't even talked about the Russians. And so I do think that we are dealing with, Putin is a KGB officer. And he does know how propaganda works. And so when we're talking about the weakness or the fragility of democracy, he is using the democratic systems to undermine democracy, and that's something we have to watch out for.
We're going to open it up in a minute, so for those of you who haven't thought of a question yet, think of one. But I just want to end, I want to give us a sense of where you think we are in history. What is this moment? Is this a moment where we're going to one phase and we'll find a new phase that will be more optimistic, where democracy can return, that we will have a fourth wave of democracy? Or are we at a tipping point where we really are entering a darker and darker chapter?
Well, I'm trying to kind of analyze, we're kind of in a third phase after the end of World War II. First one, the Cold War, and the world was divided into the red, white, and blue. And a lot of our policies had to do with supporting the people that were on our side. Then, after the fall of the wall, that incredibly euphoric period where we worked together in terms of creating new institutions and expanding institutions, and President Clinton kept building bridges to the 21st century, and really kind of thinking about what came next. 9/11 was a watershed period in the United States, and I think, I have to say, the thing that there are many things that make me different from a born American, is that I'd actually seen what it looked like when buildings had been bombed when I woke up as a child in London. But the shock of that for Native American, really was very, very deep, and kind of thought that we could always be in this magical kingdom of oceans on both sides and friendly neighbors. And so I think that is something that created a new period, plus the technology innovations. And so I think we're in a very kind of, I don't know whether a tipping point as much as a very fluid period, where the institutions are not responding to what we need. People are hungry for some answers. And I have it's an ambivalent or ambiguous statement, frankly. I believe in the resiliency of democracy, but also the fragility of democracy. And so I do have my to-do list. And my to-do list is that we all have to get out there and actually work on democracy and have people run for office, and those that don't run, support them, knock on doors, and understand that you have to be an active American citizen. We have to talk to people we disagree with in a civilized way. And then I have to say, everybody always quotes Robert Frost, but Robert Frost said, the older he got, the younger the teachers were. Well, we have just been taught by children who got out and marched in order to not have to go to school in flak jackets. And so I think that we need to be much more active in this, and we cannot normalize what is going on now.
Thanks for that. Today is the 19th anniversary of Columbine. Just to remind, we've been at this for a long time, and you were in office. It was, I remember the shock that had to the system. It's time for questions. There are roving microphones with people who are roving. We will get to the drones later. Please put up your arm. I'll recognize you. Wait for the microphone, and if you could make your question an actual question, that will be terrific. We'll go right here up front first.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your insightful remarks, Madam Secretary. I'm thinking of what happens once an authoritarian seizes power and begins to reform the institutions, whether it's packing the judiciary to undermine judicial independence, whether it's rigging elections, or whatever it is. What are the means to go backwards from that and to restore democracy?
Well, I think that that's kind of where my activist list comes in, not to think that it will go away on its own. And we are about to have elections. I think that they are very important, but also I think the issue about the press is incredibly important. And part of it is difficult because there actually is occasionally fake news. But the bottom line is that there has to be some way to understand the centrality of that. The other is that we do have to strengthen the institutions that we have. And remember the following thing. For me, this us versus them issue that's happening in the United States is so, in so many ways, debilitating. Now, I have a very idealized pictures of things. We came to the United States in 1948 and moved out to Denver, Colorado, and in the 50s, America seemed like a very middle-class country. And then when I went to college, I went to Wellesley sometime between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. We had a professor there who had done an adaptation of Candide. And so we all went around saying everything is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. And so there kind of was a sense of moving upward. And I think that we have to get that back in terms of stating our views very clearly. I do think we have to make clear that our public officials cannot be above the law. And so I think we have to call it what it all is and get people power. I happen to think one of the things you're asking about populism populism on its own is not bad. I mean, in democracies, you want people to be part of things, but I do think this is going to take activism on those of our parts that see something, say something, do something. It's not just going to happen by thinking, oh, this will all go away.
The lady in the middle of the room on the right, my right. Thanks.
Thank you so much for being here. I don't know if there's really such a thing as a new idea, but I'm interested in what excites you right now that's a new idea in policy or technology, cooking, whatever.
In my case, not cooking. I do think that there are a number of aspects out there in technology that we have not sorted out in terms of the possibility. The thing that I'm having trouble sorting out is the following thing, is that, and I often go back to talking about Václav Havel, I'm looking at Ambassador Shapiro there, is that basically he said there was dignity in work, and that the more that people were separated from their handiwork, that they could actually see what they'd created, their loss of dignity. And so I think we have to figure out what the dignity we can provide to people in terms of being able to master the technology and also having a sense that the technology is working for them. I don't know what it is, frankly, but and artificial intelligence makes me a little nervous. But I do think that there are things out there where the innovation can be made to be a positive rather than a negative. But what I'm really activated by are the kids. What I have found so interesting, and because people think that they're taking everything for granted, they're not. And the fact that they got out there, and I think we need to really push and respect them. And I am encouraged by the younger generation. They like to be called millennials, and I don't like to be called old. And so the word for people like me is a perennial. And so the perennials and the millennials.
The gentleman here in the middle. You wait, the microphone's on your right.
Secretary, I so appreciate your historical perspective, but I was kind of wondering what you had in mind in the dedication to your book, where you warn not only about the fascism without, but the fascism within. Could you move from history to psychology and tell us what you had in mind there?
Well, I think the issue is, we touched on some of this, is that we have a tendency to find people that we disagree with and then put them down. I mean, there's kind of a sense of thinking that whoever we disagree with is not as smart or as concerned or hardworking, and that is what fascism is based on, this division of people into an identification with one group at the expense of another. And to the extent that that is a little bit in all of us, I think there is this issue about wanting, as I mentioned earlier, wanting your own identity. But if my identity depends on putting down your identity, then that is the kind of fascism within. And then if that then is exacerbated by the leader, that then is feeding off of something. The part that I found interesting in all of this is that there is fascism, in contrast to just plain old autocracy, is that it comes bottom up and top down, so that there are movements in society where people are completely dissatisfied, they want something different, and then there is the charlatan demagogic leader who exacerbates that division and lives off of it, and then undermines the institutions. But the fascism within is kind of a dislike of the other, and a real kind of snobbishness about them, or just thinking that they are the other.
There's a lady in the middle with the round glasses.
I wrote my question. I want to be sure that I will not forget. how do you think the war in Yugoslavia shaped or initiated the re-emergence of fascism, I could say, / nationalism in Europe?
Evil. No, it's very interesting. Let me just say, again, my life is such a strange, peculiar life. My father was the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia right after the war. So it's one part of the world that I kind of grew up with. I understand Serbo-Croatian, and by the way, the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. And I met Tito, and I sang Tito, Tito, Ljubičice Bela. And it's one part of the world that I spent a lot of time in. I do think that what was interesting was Tito held the country together. He was a genuine fighter. And when I was studying communism in Central and Eastern Europe, the only place that had a genuine museum for the Communist Party were the Yugoslavs, because they actually fought. The rest of them kind of were stuck in and photoshopped into their pictures. But I think then what happens is he dies, and Milosevic comes in and is not and really exacerbated nationalism, Serb nationalism, and went to Kosovo, for instance, and undermined the autonomy that they had been granted, and he made his strength off of nationalism. Now, I can tell you this, is that during the war, there were a lot of Serbs that didn't like me. They said, your father used to like Serbs. And my father used to say that if he weren't a Czechoslovak, he'd happily be a Serb, but not what the Serbs were doing at the time, taking advantage of the position from Belgrade in order to undermine the rest of the country, which then really brought a nationalist feeling into the other countries, other parts of the Republic, Slovenia and Croatia. And so, but I do think that then that is something that brought nationalism to the forefront in the rest of Europe. I think it did have an effect, and I think there really were questions because what was going on, Milosevic was practicing ethnic cleansing, which is going after the other, and I think, and the other were Muslims. And so it became much more of a Serb Orthodox versus Bosnian Muslims, and then that spread. But it is definitely a result of a leader that played off nationalism to gain power.
The lady right up here, right here in the third row.
Thank you so much. I so much appreciate this opportunity. How would you advise someone like myself and those, myself particularly and those others, having triumphed over so much yourself, every single day, when you talk about the rise of fascism, that's our life every single day. I'm a 59-year-old African-American Muslim woman, so I'm kind of like the triple thing. Yeah. So I kind of get it all. I've survived the civil rights movement being 59. And I mean, I feel it so intensely every single where I go, you know, and we move forward and we push on. And I'm very grateful for having had the experience of the civil rights movement because I have a really strong backbone. However, it's very difficult. So thank you.
Okay.
I do think that I can identify in the following way as a refugee to this country. And I always felt very welcomed. By the way, I have to tell this story. We spent the war in England, and with apologies on this story, and people would say, we're so sorry your country's been taken over by a terrible system, by a terrible dictator. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you, and when are you going home? When we came to the United States, people said, we're so sorry, your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you, and when will you become a citizen? And my father said, that is what made America different from every country. And I think that is what we have to remember. The strength of America are people like you. And that really our strength is in our diversity. And therefore, among the various things that I'm appalled by that are happening in this administration is the fear factor about anybody that doesn't look exactly like them, and creating rapists and terrorists and drug dealers out of people that come from a different background. And we have to remember what the Statue of Liberty says. And I really do think that those of us that do come from different backgrounds need to be together and support each other. And by the way, one of the things that I did, when I went to the State Department, there were not high-level Muslims that worked there. I'm the first one to put iftar dinners on the official calendar. And then what happened was that we were trying to explain, as most Americans knew nothing about Islam, much less the difference between Shia and Sunni. And so I wrote a book when I left about the role of religion in foreign policy. We need to understand it. And we need to understand it in the United States. America is about you.
Et loose here right up front. Today is Why Democracy is in Danger Day at the Chicago Council, because Et will be speaking at the council about his book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, later on today. Right here up front, please.
So Ed, apologies, and to you for my British comment.
No, they ring very true. And I chose the wrong day to be speaking about. You've spoken very eloquently about the role that the United States played in the post-war decades, the Cold War and afterwards, in promoting democracy. My question is about the influence America had as a model for democracy in the way it behaved and functioned during those decades, as an example to others. How has, bearing in mind this is a non-partisan organization, I apologize for the question, but how has the experience of the world watching President Trump affected the attractiveness of the model of democracy?
But let me just say, even before that, I do speak often about my experiences with the National Democratic Institute, and trying to explain our democracy. And by the way, NDI does not go around just talking about American democracy. The first thing we had done was in Chile, and so we began to take Chileans with us, or now we take a lot of Central and Eastern Europe, or we did, into other parts of the world, the Middle East, in order to show the universality of democracy and a lot of the aspects. But one of the problems we had was in Egypt, and this was during the Obama administration, frankly, in terms of what was happening to the people that worked there. And we, before that, had talked about what the nuts and bolts are of democracy. And we had gone to places and said, well, the essence of democracy is compromise. And they said, yeah, like you guys. And so the bottom line is that our arguing and kind of the gridlock stuff is not helping in terms of explaining what democracy is about. And so I do think America's role generally is very much watched in what we do. And I think that it's essential that we understand that we are viewed as the beacon of democracy and the world's oldest democracy. And I think that that has been forgotten. And it does play a very large role, and I have felt it as I've gone around. I think one of the hardest parts, I have to say, is traveling around now. As a former diplomat, it is not appropriate to criticize your own country when you're abroad. So I've been asked about President Trump, does he embarrass me? And I said, no, he saddens me. That's the best I can do diplomatically. But I think it is very hard to explain what's going on. And people want to know what our policies are, not just on democracy, but generally. And it undermines our position, because I was in Mexico not long ago when the position on NAFTA changed overnight. I was on a panel, and by the time we talked the next day, it was completely different. And any number of things in terms of where he was on NATO or what he's doing, what his relationship is with Putin, all of it is very hard to explain, and it undermines our position. President Clinton was the first one to actually use the indispensable, that we're an indispensable nation. I just used it so often it became identified with me. And there's nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. We need to be working with other countries, partners. You and I were talking about the West generally. We need our partners to talk about what a democratic government is about, basically.
I'm going to go here in the middle, the lady with the white sweater.
Hi. Concerning Nikki Haley's at the UN's response to the Syrian chemical weapons attack, would you offer an opinion if you think she needs additional tools in her toolbox to strengthen our democratic response to that?
Well, I did spend time at the UN, which I really loved, but the Security Council is a little bit like a Rubik's Cube in many ways. So when we were in office, we wanted to have Germany and Japan become permanent members of the Security Council. The first people to come to us were the Italians, saying, "This is outrageous, we lost the war too," which is not a great campaign slogan. And then I would go to some European leader, ambassador there, to say, "I need your help on a vote." And the ambassador would say, "I'm so sorry, I can't help you right now because EU does not yet have a common position." And then 2 days later, I'd go back to the same person and say, "Can you help me now?" And the ambassador would say, "No, because the EU does have a common position." So there really are questions in terms of the way that it operates and what America's position is there. The hardest part, and she's dealing with this, is when the Russians make very clear they're going to block something. We went through that in terms of what was going on in Kosovo. And it makes it very hard to act in that particular way. I think Ambassador Haley has been stalwart in pushing back on a number of different issues and making America's position clear. I was kind of troubled at the beginning when she said she was taking names, but I do think that she has, in fact, is trying to defend what is going on. It would help if the decision-making process in the United States were somewhat more organized. I was an instructed ambassador. That's you. Even though you're a cabinet member, you are an instructed ambassador, but it does mean that the decisions have been made in some organized fashion and you happen to know where the president is. And so she needs help in that particular part, but she is stuck a little bit within the Security Council with what the Russians are doing. I think the question is how to take the issue of the chemical weapons inspectors and all of that out of that and put it into a venue that in fact allows more support to push the Syrians to allow the inspectors to go in. But it is tough, especially when the Russians are blocking things.
Madam Secretary, one other book you wrote, which we haven't talked about, was called Read My Pins.
Yes.
And perhaps as the final at the conclusion, you can read the pin. We can read your pin, and what's the meaning of it?
Well, first I have to tell you how this all started. When I was at the Security Council, I was an instructed ambassador, and my instructions were to say perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein so we could keep the sanctions on, because the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. So I did that, and all of a sudden there was a poem that appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. And I had a snake pin, so I wore that whenever we talked about Iraq. And so I think you've all seen where the ambassadors come out and talk to the press, and all of a sudden the camera zeroed in and said, "Why are you wearing that snake pin?" And I said, "Because Saddam Hussein compared me to an unparalleled serpent." And I thought, this is fun. So I went out and I bought a bunch of costume jewelry to depict whatever we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons, and on bad days, a lot of carnivorous animals and insects. And so when we were talking about what we were going to do, I'd say, "Read my pin." So that's how it all started. So my pin today, is Mercury, the messenger. And so this is what I am trying to do, is to deliver a message about not normalizing what is going on and talking about activism and what our responsibilities are as citizens. I am so grateful to be an American. I can't tell you. and so grateful to this country, but it does depend on all of us being active and supporting and speaking out against that kind of sense of the us versus them, and remembering that the Constitution begins with we the people. Thank you all very, very much.
If I can ask everybody to please remain seated so that in this narrow corridor, Secretary Albright can get to the place where she will be signing books. Again, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you all so much for your Chicago hospitality. Great. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.